Okay, let's just dive right in. I want you to picture something. The year is 1346. You're living in medieval Europe, and let's be honest, life is already incredibly difficult. You're working from the moment the sun comes up to the moment it goes down every single day. There's no such thing as modern medicine, no antibiotics, nothing like that. Oh, and if you get a toothache, your best bet is the local blacksmith.
Yeah. On average, you're probably not going to live past the age of 35. People are actually suspicious of taking hot baths because they think it opens up your pores to disease. So, things are not great. And then, right when you think it absolutely cannot get any worse, something else arrives. Something from the east.
Something that would go on to kill somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. And no, that is not a typo. We're talking up to 200 million dead across the world in just a handful of years.
To try and wrap your head around that, that was roughly 1 out of every 3 human beings alive on the entire planet at the time. Gone. This was the Black Death, the single deadliest pandemic in all of recorded history. And today, we're going to look at what it was, where it came from, and how on earth people tried to fight an enemy they couldn't even see.
So, what was this terrifying invisible killer? Well, the answer is a tiny, microscopic bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Now, of course, we know all about bacteria and germs today. But back in the 1340s, nobody had a clue that these microscopic life forms even existed. They were, quite literally, fighting an enemy that was completely invisible.
And this right here just shows you how impossible their situation was. The Black Death storms into Europe in 1347. The first real microscope doesn't get invented until the 1670s. That is a 320-year gap. Just think about that for a second. Imagine trying to solve a crime, but you won't be given the magnifying glass for over 3 centuries. That is the situation they were in.
And that invisible enemy was just horrifying. It actually came in 3 different forms. First, the most common was bubonic plague. That's the one you've probably heard of, named for these awful swellings called buboes. If you got that, your chances of survival were not great, a 30 to 60% mortality rate. But then there was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. It could spread just by coughing or sneezing. The mortality rate, up to 95%. And finally, the deadliest of all, septicemic plague, a direct infection of the blood. With that one, the mortality rate was essentially 100%. People could die within hours.
Which leads to the big question. Where did this microscopic monster actually come from? For hundreds of years, nobody really knew. But very recently, modern science finally gave us the answer. And it's like we've solved a 700-year-old cold case.
So here's how they cracked it. Archaeologists found these old gravestones in what is now Kyrgyzstan, dating from 1338 and 1339, and the inscriptions on them mention a mysterious pestilence. So flash forward to 2022. Scientists take ancient DNA from the teeth of the bodies in those graves, and they find it. A perfect match. The genetic fingerprint of Yersinia pestis. The starting point, the origin of the Black Death, was finally found.
So from Central Asia, the plague basically hitched a ride on the medieval world's biggest highway, the Silk Road. For centuries, this network carried silk and spices, but now it was carrying death. By 1346, it reaches the busy port city of Caffa, and during a siege, the attacking Mongol army started catapulting plague-infected corpses over the city walls, one of the first, most horrifying acts of biological warfare in history. The people inside, terrified, fled on ships, and in October 1347, those ships docked in Sicily. The Black Death had officially arrived in Europe.
And the speed of its spread from there is just staggering. 1347, it's in Sicily. By 1348, it is ripped through Italy, France, and Spain. And in June or July of that year, it lands in England at the port of Weymouth in Dorset. By 49, it's in Germany and Scandinavia. By 1351, it's all the way in Russia. It conquered an entire continent in less than 4 years. And remember, there are no planes, no trains, no cars. This was all happening at the speed of a ship, a cart, or a person walking.
The impact was apocalyptic. The city of Florence, one of the most vibrant in the world, lost up to half its entire population. England lost somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people. That's nearly half of everyone living there. Entire villages were wiped out so completely they just ceased to exist. They became lost villages that archaeologists are still finding traces of today.
So really try to put yourself in their shoes. You have no concept of germs. You don't own a microscope. There is no science to explain what's happening.
What do you do? What do you think is causing this nightmare that seems to be ending the world?
Well, you get creative. The most popular theory was that it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins. This led to groups like the Flagellants, who would march from town to town, whipping themselves in public to show how sorry they were. The Pope actually had to ban them in October 1349. Other people blamed miasma, or just bad air. But my absolute favorite comes from the University of Paris. They issued an official academic report blaming a rare alignment of the planets. I'm not kidding. A university, an official report, planets.
But all this confusion and fear had a much, much darker side. Tragically and completely shamefully, people looked for someone to blame. And across Europe, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells to cause the plague. This led to horrific persecution and massacres. It's truly one of the most awful chapters of this entire period.
And the so-called cures were just as desperate and bizarre. Doctors were trying their absolute best, but with zero useful information, they prescribed things like applying a dead toad to the swellings, or bathing in urine. If you were really wealthy, you might be told to eat crushed-up emeralds. But the best one, the absolute winner, has to be the advice to go and sit in a sewer. The logic was that the really, really bad air from the sewer would drive away the slightly less bad air of the plague. You can't make this stuff up.
The first massive wave of the plague finally began to burn out around 1353, but it kept coming back for centuries. The damage was done. It took the global population nearly 200 years to recover to the numbers it had before the Black Death began. 200 years.
But in its wake, the world was changed forever. With up to half the workforce gone, there was a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, the surviving peasants had power. They could demand better pay, better conditions. This completely shattered the old feudal system, and it led directly to huge events like the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. The authority of the church was weakened, people started to question everything. And many historians argue that this catastrophe actually sowed the seeds for the Renaissance and the Reformation.
But the plague's legacy isn't all about huge societal shifts. It also left behind some pretty fascinating and kind of weird historical quirks, including an amazing story about a pope.
Okay, have you ever wondered about this nursery rhyme? There's a popular theory that it's actually about the Black Death. Think about it. Ring-a-ring of roses could be the red, ring-like rash that was a symptom. A pocket full of posies were the flowers people carry to ward off the bad air. Achoo-achoo, well, that's the sneezing from the pneumonic plague. And we all fall down, yeah, that part's pretty obvious. Now, historians still debate this, but if it's true, you're welcome for ruining a childhood classic for you forever.
And this next one is brilliant. It shows how medieval logic could sometimes just stumble into the right answer for all the wrong reasons. In 1348, Pope Clement VI's doctors told him to sit between two enormous bonfires, day and night, to purify the air. So he spent a sweltering hot summer in France, sweating in all his papal robes between two roaring fires. It sounds absurd, right? But here's the crazy part. It might have actually worked. Not because it purified the air, but because the intense heat probably killed or at least drove away the fleas that were carrying the plague bacterium in the first place. Wrong method, right result. Amazing.
Okay, that was a huge amount of frankly terrifying information. But how much of it actually stuck in your brain? Let's do a quick knowledge check and find out.
Okay, 6 questions for you. Question 1. When and where did the plague first reach England? 2. What was England's estimated death toll? 3. What was the global death toll? 4. What is the scientific name of the bacterium? 5. Where did it originate as confirmed just recently in 2022? And finally, question 6. Why did the plague weaken the feudal system? I'll give you a moment to think.
All right, pencils down. Let's see how you did. The plague hit Weymouth in Dorset in June or July of 1348. England's death toll was absolutely staggering, 1.5 to 2.5 million people. Globally, it killed up to 200 million, or about 1 in every 3 people. The bacterium is called Yersinia pestis. Its origin was traced all the way back to Kyrgyzstan, and finally, it weakened the feudal system, because that massive labor shortage gave peasants real bargaining power for the very first time. So how did you do?
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? I think it's that the Black Death was a battle fought in complete darkness, a war against an invisible enemy that nobody understood at all. And that leaves us with one last big question. How would our hyper-connected, scientific, modern world cope with a global threat it couldn't see and maybe for a time simply didn't understand? That's something to think about.